Hey everyone. Today we are going to read Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It begins on page 63. Again, sometimes I will be modeling during reading strategies, in particular asking questions while reading, and also talking about conflict. Remember, there are several types of conflict. There's character versus self. That is when a character has an internal struggle. So it's almost like having a little devil here and then a little angel here, and a character is trying to decide whether, which decision to make. Then there's character versus character, and that's, Harry Potter versus Voldemort, or any character that is against somebody else. And there's a disagreement, a struggle. Then there is character versus society. Character versus society is an individual versus a community or a culture or a race. So, and I don't mean like a race, a running race. I mean like whether or not you're a minority or a gender. And then there is character versus nature. Character versus nature has to do with a natural phenomenon that causes some kind of strife or dysfunction in a character's world. So Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So the last chapter had the narrator using the pronoun I. In this case, the narrator is talking about Brent. So we don't see the pronoun I being used. Again, page 63. The sun had long set. To the west, over the Pacific, the sky was still faintly blue, clinging to the memory of day. Brent moved to a seat across the aisle so as to scan the darker eastern sky, waded through a long stretch of trees, then thought he spotted it. Deneb, in the constellation Cygnus, the swan. He squinted at his book, then out the bus window. Now that they were out of Los Angeles, the air was much clearer. He looked again and was amazed to make out the shape of a cross with Deneb at its head, just as in the book. He grinned in the darkness, unknown to those around him. He spoke the word Deneb in his mind and felt himself to be Adam, naming the new world around him. Adam is a reference to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, the first man and first woman. He took his flashlight from his pack and read on. He'd bought the book in a store he'd passed in San Francisco using the Visa card his parents had gotten him. He'd also bought 6 blades for his saw, more sandpaper, and a San Francisco map, and had used the card to get more cash. He'd planned on building the whirligig there, but after a day of freezing in the fog and a night in a cheap hotel, unable to sleep for all the shouting and footsteps, he climbed back onto the bus that morning, heading south to San Diego. This would put the whirligig closer to the corner of the country and would put him in a warmer climate. So we could actually say that at this moment, when there was so much fog and it was so cold in San Francisco, that it's character versus nature, Brent versus the climate. So Brent has to make a decision to either build the whirligig in San Francisco or to move lower to San Diego. And he does so because the climate of San Diego is better than in San Francisco. He'd brought nothing long-sleeved. He hadn't mentioned this oversight or any others when he'd called his parents from the bus station in Los Angeles. They were dubious enough about the trip as it was. Dubious, if you didn't know, you could look it up on dictionary.com, and it means that they were questioning, skeptical. Just as in the first call he made, they'd barraged him with questions, reminders, and cautions. He'd half listened, curiously fingering his blonde hair. He'd forgotten to bring shampoo and had washed it with soap, leaving it stiff as cardboard. I'm sure all of you can make a personal connection of when your parents are calling you and you're sitting there going, yeah, so I'm going to play Fortnite tonight and I'm going to call my friend and, oh, maybe I'll change my, makeup today. I'm sure that's an easy personal connection of half listening to an adult. or me, for instance, although I am sure none of you do that. You are always listening to me. Setting out by eye from Deneb, he found Vega, then Altair. He hadn't realized before that individual stars had names. The book called these three, quote, the summer triangle, unquote. He stared at Vega, the brightest, bluish white, and felt it stare back at him. They held the gaze like tango dancers while the woman behind him snored obliviously. The trio of stars shone for him alone. By now he was accustomed to feeling separate from the other passengers. For them, the bus was an interlude. For him, it was home. So right there is an example of Brent feeling like he has a conflict with the community at large. And that community are people who ride the bus. People who ride the bus usually are going from point A to point B. However, Brent, this is really his most time spent is on a bus going from the four corners, however which way he goes, of the United States. So unlike the people on the bus, this is considered a home to him. And that's why it would be character versus society. No other existence outside of travel awaited him. It was all as familiar to him as if he'd been writing for years. The scent of the bathroom, the menu at meal stops, the inevitable drinker far to the rear, the old woman in the first row who asked the driver to confirm that she was on the right bus every 10 miles. It was an anonymous community, just right for him. Again, anonymous community. It actually identifies the society that Brent is identifying with. But unlike the others, when he stepped off the bus, he'd remain in a world of nameless strangers. He looked out, except now he knew Deneb and Vega and Altair. It was 10 when the bus stopped in San Diego. Joints creaking, Brent clumped down the stairs. The passengers gathered their luggage beside the bus, then scattered, their community disbanding. He alone remained outside, leaning his pack against a wall and fishing through his pockets for the paper. Excuse me. A young woman from Holland who'd gotten off in Santa Barbara had told him about youth hostels and had let him copy an address from her book. After the night in the San Francisco flop house, he was ready for a change, though not ready to use his visa to stay somewhere like the Sheraton, as his parents had begged him. The trip was his to take, not theirs. The hostel, cheap, friendly, filled with students, sounded more interesting. Excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. So for those of you who don't know what the Sheraton is, it's usually a high, like 4 or 5 star hotel. Youth hostels actually exist all over Europe, and lots of college students go backpacking across Europe using the hostels because they're cheap and they're friendly. Excuse, please. Brent looked up. A short, mustached man with a suitcase stood before him. In one hand, he held a tiny address book. I wonder, sir, if you can tell me where this address is in San Diego. My brother's house. Brent knew he would be of no help. But when the man held the address book toward him, pointing to the bottom line with a pen, he instinctively stepped forward, bent over the book, studied the microscopic writing, then caught a flash of movement and turned. Behind him, a scruffy teenager had a hand on his backpack. Brent stared at him, speechless. He saw the door he'd come through. Then he glanced back at the first man, realized they were a team, saw no one to appeal to except 2 drivers at the far end of the station, and yelled, "Leave me alone!" loudly enough that both drivers turned. The thieves exchanged a long look. The hand reluctantly released his pack. Then the pair skulked wordlessly into the night. So here is character versus character. It doesn't matter that there are 2 men that are trying to steal Brent's things. It's still Brent versus somebody else. It took 3 packages of potato chips before Brent's heart slowed to normal speed. He was inside the station, squeezed onto a bench, surrounded by fellow travelers, and safe. It dawned on him why animals lived in herds. He scouted the room's perimeter for predators, decided against walking to the hostel, marched outside, and got a cab. Through its window, he saw the summer triangle following him and felt watched over. The cab parked. Brent hefted his pack from the trunk and stood on the sidewalk after the cab left. The night air was warm. A bird was singing somewhere. Beside him, he now saw, stood a palm tree. He sighted up its long trunk, touched it, and felt he'd entered a different country. The impression was deepened when he walked up the steps and past the porch where two women were sitting in wicker rockers and conversing in a language he couldn't place. Brent passed them and presented himself at the desk. "Passport or visa, please," said the clerk. He was young, with a pungent English accent and a head heaped with black curls. "Passport?" Brent was stunned. "I'm American." "We only take foreign travelers," said the clerk. "The theory being, as I understand it, that this being your own country, you've already got yourself a place to stay." Brent sighed conspicuously, wondered what to do, glanced at a couple huddled over a map, and saw that the hostel was simply a large house and that he was standing in a corner of its living room. Of course, it being as late as it is and unlikely that anyone else will show up, and we being unusually empty as it happened, you might just convince me you're Canadian. A smile flickered on the clerk's lips. Brent stared at him and slowly comprehended. "What city was it you're from?" the man asked. Brent racked his brain, then thought of the cyclist he'd met at the campground in Washington. "Prince George," he answered. "And what's Canada's capital?" Brent rummaged madly through his mind in vain. "Ottawa, right you are," supplied the clerk. "And what year did England wrest control of your fair country from France?" Brent knew this fact was somewhere in his memory. 1763, right again," said the clerk. He handed Brent a pen and gestured grandly toward the register. "Welcome." He gave Brent a tour and showed him to the room he'd share with 3 other males. Floating up the stairway came the faint peeping of a concertina. Brent had glimpsed the player in the dining room, a bearded man, eyes closed, his fingers punching out the melody on their own. After coming out of the bathroom, Brent stood listening to the cheery, reedy sound. He envied the man his power to entertain himself and others. There seemed no end to his stock of tunes. He thought back to the cyclist, admirably self-contained as well, not simply with his dome tent and gas lamp, but with his go game and his thick book on the subject. By comparison, his own life seemed unfurnished with skills and interest. He desired to become the man he was impersonating. So here's a perfect example of 2 conflicts. 1, character versus society. So again, Brent is filled with conflict because he feels lesser than the people that he is surrounded by, which is the cyclist or the person who happens to be playing the concertina. I'm sorry, but I will have to look up what a concertina is in a little bit. If I was reading this on my own, I would look it up now, but I don't want to waste the time. However, at the end of that paragraph on page 68, it said he desired to become the man he was impersonating. So there's that internal conflict, the one where he looks at his life before the accident as his first life, and this life since the accident as his second life. And he wants to embrace who he's become, the traveling person, getting to know people, spreading joy through whirligigs. He woke to find himself alone in the room. He smelled bacon. Like gravity, this scent pulled him irresistibly downstairs. The hostel served a free continental breakfast. Those who'd bought their own groceries were cooking more substantial fare in the kitchen. Cautiously, he entered the fray, nonchalantly poured some coffee, a drink he'd tried only once, grabbed a pastry, and took a seat. A minute later, a young man sat across from him and asked, "Where are you from?" "Canada." Brent kept his voice low. He sipped his coffee, fought back a grimace, and reached for the sugar bowl. "What part?" "British Columbia," he mumbled, praying there were no Canadians present. He ate his sweet roll nervously. The lies were piling up. That he was a coffee drinker, a Canadian, and most serious, that he was a mere tourist, not a convicted killer on a mission of repentance. This goes back to when we first were introduced to Brent as somebody who had moved a lot, and he actually thought of his ability to make up his past situation where he lived before as some amazing thing. Like I can't remember what kind of car he owned, a Jaguar maybe, in his, the city before he had moved to Chicago. So it's interesting that those lies serviced him well, because nobody that he met could make it factual, like see if it was factual or not. But these lies seemed to be hitting him differently. Not only his every word, but his every bite and breath was counterfeit. Prison, where no pretense was needed, suddenly seemed the better choice. So I can infer by him thinking that prison is a better choice that he's exhausted from all of this lying, that the fact that he is a convicted killer is really weighing on him. And this speaks to character versus self. He's really conflicted with himself. His table mate was German, a year older, traveling before starting college in the fall. Brent was amazed that he had no accent. After 1 year of French and 3 of Spanish, he could neither understand nor speak a sentence in either language. His companion mentioned that he'd just finished 2 years before the mast and would pass it on to him. Brent sensed from the boy's comments that he knew more about American history than Brent himself did. The boy was tall, with strawberry blonde hair. The two could be mistaken for each other at a distance. Brent studied him in secret admiration, thinking that he might easily have been born into his body instead, might speak his 3 languages and know all that he knew. When the German asked if he wanted to see the sights downtown with him, Brent at once abandoned his plan to start the next whirligig. A half hour later, they were boarding a city bus. The Pacific in the distance, the red tile roofs, the palm trees, and countless Mexican restaurants all made Brent feel gloriously distant from Chicago. Mexico was only 20 miles away, according to the German boy. He introduced himself as Emil. They got off the bus at Balboa Park, headed for the San Diego Zoo, and spent the rest of the morning strolling through mesas, rainforests, and aviaries. Emil would be studying biology at his university and provided a constant commentary on bird plumages and migration, European snakes, the evolution of the elephant. Fantasizing he was beholding his own double, Brent watched raptly when Emil made sketches and jotted notes. Again, this continues to be character versus self, because Brent is really struggling with his own self-identity. At this point, he really wants to be Emil. "I'm sorry if I'm talking too much," he said to Brent. "Both my parents are teachers." "No problem. They would like me to become one as well." "A teacher lives forever through his students. These are my father's favorite words." Brent suddenly thought back to Miss Gill, the mediator in Chicago, and her saying that the effects of an act traveled far beyond one's knowledge. He knew she'd meant harmful acts like his. He saw now that the same could be said of good deeds, such as a teacher's years of inspiring. Everything we did, good, bad, and indifferent, sent a wave rolling out of sight. He wondered what his own accounting, generations later, would look like. Do you agree with Brent that everything we do, good, bad, or otherwise, continues to impact people? What would you like people to remember about you?